Chapter 45. The Aborigines, Section 4. The violence of the natives seemed to require some extraordinary means for its repression, and in November 1826 it was resolved to capture the leaders by the usual methods of arrest. The magistrates were authorized by the governor, when danger was feared, to drive them to a safe distance by force, to repress their attempts at disturbance by treating them as rioters, to seize those charged with felonies, whether known by marks or by names, or by the denomination of their tribe. And any person was authorized to raise the neighborhood on witnessing the commission of a crime. This notice was renewed the following year, and the military stationed in the interior were instructed to render such assistance as might be necessary for its practical application. But these measures were not attended with much success, and in April 1828 the natives were forbidden to enter the settled districts of the colony. They were permitted to pass through them when on their passage to the shore, provided their chiefs guaranteed their quietness and possessed a pass under the hand and seal of the governor. A line, drawn from Piper's River to St. Patrick's Head, separated the regions allotted to them on that side. Another included Tasman's Peninsula, a third southward of Mount Wellington to the ocean, and the fourth from the Huon by Western Bluff southwest to the sea. Thus the proclamation cut out the centre of the island. A square at the northwest belonged to the Van Diemen's Land Company and others, southward from Ben Lomond, including most of the rivers, plains and lagoons. Into these they were forbidden to intrude. There remained the forests of the southwest, the western coasts, where the skies forever weep, and the barren shores of the northeast. To drive them on these regions was the duty of the forces and their employment for years. The natives returned regularly with the season, like birds of passage. Avenging the losses of their last retreat, they retired at the usual time, diminished but unsubdued. In looking at these orders and proclamations, it is impossible to regard them in any other light than as plans of military operation. That the natives would surrender to a warrant or a challenge, that they would remain in remote regions from which they had always been accustomed to come forth, that their chiefs had power to enforce the mandates of the governor, or that they would preserve an official document they could neither read nor understand. These were contingencies which, though desirable, were certainly not probable. The precise and legal language of the instruments provoked much ridicule and might justify a smile. They were chiefly dictated by a gentleman whose mental aberration led to his removal from office. It is, however, difficult to suggest more explicit forms, and the announcement of the plans of government was a proper preliminary to their execution. It was the desire of the governor, earnestly expressed, to protect the settlers, and yet to mitigate their resentment. The use of arms was forbidden, while other means were untried, and rewards were offered to any person who might venture into communication with the natives to explain the objects of the government. They were invited to seek redress of their grievances, and pictures were suspended in the wood, in which the white man was represented shooting the native and the governor hanging the white. These remedies were, however, ineffectual, and in November 1828 the settled districts were placed under the protection of martial law. 9 parties, under Messrs. G. Robertson, Batman and Jorgensen, consisting of 7 persons each, and assisted by the military when requisite, were employed to enforce the proclamation. Mr. Anstey, the magistrate, directed the operations in the centre of the island, and volunteers not unfrequently joined in the repulsion or pursuit of this unhappy people. The celebrated chief, Umara, was captured by Mr. Gilbert Robertson in the eastern marshes in 1828. This euphonious name, which so interests the ear, it is said, was a corruption or improvement of the name of a colonist, Hugh Murray, and adopted by the savage. A strong party, consisting of military and constables, surrounded the hut, in which this chief and others were sheltered. 5 furious dogs rushed towards Mr. Robertson, the foremost of the party, having fired off his piece and seized a lad scrambling away. By him he was directed to a sheet of bark, under which Umara was concealed. While prostrate, a shot was fired at him, which inflicted a flesh wound, and the musket of a soldier was broken by beating him. Such is Robertson's indignant account of his capture. With the chief, 3 others, Jack, Dolly and Jemmy, were taken. The portrait of the last has rather an innocent expression and has been honoured with publication. This party, removed first to Richmond and then to Hobart Town, soon appeared reconciled to their captivity, all but Umara. He was pensive and reserved, and for a time resented his bondage. It is said the outrages he had committed would have forfeited his life had not his captor earnestly maintained that he was a prisoner of war, and that to put him to death would be to equal his crimes. The expeditions were attended with the same general incidents, and it would be tedious to multiply examples. The number of prisoners was lamentably disproportioned to the many that perished. To identify a particular offender was impossible, nor was it of much importance, since the natives now were animated by one spirit. The amazing agility with which they moved, their magical powers of self-concealment, their destitution of dress, the greasing of their skin, and the vigilance of their watchdogs rendered it nearly impossible to seize them in open day. An alarm would be given that the blacks were approaching, and a party commissioned to repress them would immediately advance, often blundering and incautious, shouting, smoking, and straggling about, carelessly firing their pieces and affording abundant information of their approach. Thus, after a fatiguing march, the natives, whom they were sent out to meet, would be observed in their rear, having already committed the premeditated depredation. Not that it was easy to elude their observation if they were conscious of pursuit, and it was nearly impossible to overtake them. Mr. Gilbert Robertson, after capturing Umara, was 12 months without success. One tribe he followed with pertinacity were not far off through the whole chase. Their fires were visible. They were, for several days, on the hills, not more than 4 miles from the British, but they beat round and round like a hare. A tribe, after a hot pursuit, concealed their tracks and suddenly vanished. They regularly posted sentinels, passed over the most dangerous ground, and on the margin of fearful precipices. They would lie down beside a log, stone dead, and could not be distinguished from the charred fragments of the forest. Those who imagined that their eyes had never been averted would yet lose sight of the subtle enemy. They could not catch them except by stratagem, or, when they were caught, they could not hold them. The few captives that were obtained, when they thought proper, easily made their escape. They confined them in a room. Next morning they had passed through the flue into the open air and freedom. The extreme difficulty connected with their arrest by day led to their rapid destruction. The pursuers would watch as the evening gathered in, the thin smoke of the distant fires. They would cautiously advance and conceal themselves till midnight. The superstitious terror of the black prevented his wandering from the camp, lest the evil spirit that haunted the darkness should carry him away. Thus, stretched around the fire, the natives were easily seen, and musketry told with terrible effect. Their dogs, instead of promoting their safety, sometimes led to their sacrifice. A party, preparing to surround and capture them without bloodshed, would move with quiet steps, without giving notice to the Aborigines. But just, when all was prepared for the last movement, some cur of ill omen would start up and rouse them. They would seize their spears and attempt to flee, and the whites, now disappointed of a bloodless capture, would commence the slaughter. In 1828, a tribe of natives threw stones at the constables from a hill. They returned a volley of shot, then charged with the bayonet. The whole were slain. The excuse for the massacre was that, having no more ammunition, the constables had no other means of defense, and that to retreat was dangerous. An exploit claimed by a corporal and party of the 40th Regiment is disputed. They professed to have discovered a tribe lodged on the shelf of a rock, enclosed by wall-like heights. They poured in their fire and dragged the women and children from their shelter. All perished. This was stated to be a mere tale of pretended success, and devised to satisfy the neighborhood that the men had done their duty. It proves, at least, that such achievements were in request. How fearful a condition for the government to tolerate, or for a colony to approve. In these expeditions, natives were often the guides and were enabled to follow up the track of their countrymen when the English were confounded. In those troublesome times, individuals of the tribes were often left behind. It was the custom to fix small pieces of stick at short distances to assist the stragglers in rejoining their main body. For a time, these signals being understood by the black guides brought them quickly on the route of the fugitives, But the guides soon betrayed or exhausted this device, and though they continued to leave direction sticks, they reversed their meaning and distracted their pursuers. The Tasmanian allies themselves were exceedingly uncertain and prone to escape. They disclosed to their countrymen the plans adopted for their capture, related the expeditions they had witnessed, and added new excitements to rage. Sydney natives were obtained to assist in the capture. Pigeon and John Crook, under the care of Mr. Batman, promoted the success of the undertaking. Pigeon narrowly escaped being shot. He wandered from his party and was seen by a stockman in a tree, who fired in spite of his endeavours to explain. Pigeon then slipped down and reached his friends, only in time to avoid the second charge of his pertinacious antagonist. The story is worth relating, not on account of the actors, but because it displays how cheap, at that hour, was the life of a native, although peaceably living in the forests of his country. Among those distinguished for the knowledge of the bush, compassion for the natives, and skill in pursuing them, Mr. Batman was the subject of frequent and approving mention. It is said by Backhouse that his parties killed 30 and captured 5. Occasionally, natives were found in the neighbourhood of Ben Lomond. In one instance, it is recorded that 10 fell and that 2 were taken, and in another that 40 received the fire and left behind them trails of blood, but no captives. On another, 15 or 16 were said to fall, out of a party of 70. 300 buckshots were poured into an encampment at 20 yards distance. It would be endless to recite conflicts of this kind. They probably were but a multiplication of a short bulletin, referring to an expedition, 5 shot and 1 taken. Looked at alone, even in the mildest form, these measures are revolting. But to Mr. Batman belongs the praise of mingling humanity with severity, of perceiving human affections in the creatures he was commissioned to resist. His mission cannot be compared with that of his successor, but he certainly began in the midst of conflict and bloodshed to try the softer influences of conciliation and charity. He received a party into his house, endeavoured to win their regard, fed, clothed, and soothed them, and when some of them disappointed his hopes by throwing off their garments and retiring into the bush, he still persevered in attempting their reclamation. But if the authorized system was attended with a sad sacrifice of native life, no one will question the atrocities committed by commandos, first formed by stockkeepers and some settlers under the influence of anger, and then continued from habit. The smoke of a fire was the signal for a black hunt. The sportsmen, having taken up their positions, perhaps on a precipitous hill, would first discharge their guns, then rush towards the fires and sweep away the whole party. The wounded were brained, the infant cast into the flames, the musket was driven into the quivering flesh, and the social fire, around which the natives gathered to slumber, became, before morning, their funeral pile. A detail of such facts is in the hand of the writer, the recital of which would disgrace, without improving mankind, and it is rather in deference to a general principle than personal considerations that the crimes of amateur assassins are left to oblivion. Footnotes: unless the blacks are exterminated or removed, conciliation is in vain. Shall the sons of a country give way before the Aborigines after having repulsed the arms of France? They are now shot with as little remorse as so many crows. Colonial Advocate, 1828. A party under Major Grey went out in pursuit, overtook a few blacks. One was seized, but he was so smeared with grease that he slipped through the hands of his captors. A paper of the day recommends that the arms of the pursuer be thrust under the arms of the black, and, the hands being raised, to be firmly clasped over the back of the fugitive's neck, an expedient that reminds us of the salt specific for catching birds, with which most children have been delighted and disappointed. End of chapter 45, being the Aborigines. Section 4.